The B-26 Marauder had a nickname that made grown men go pale. They called it the Widowmaker. And in the spring of 1943, a 22-year-old crew chief named Jack Matheson was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in war is be right when everyone else is wrong. Matheson wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was a mechanic. His job was to keep the birds flying, not to question the engineers back in Baltimore who designed them. But when he made a modification to his plane that violated every Army Air Force's regulation in the book, he didn't just save his crew. He accidentally created the deadliest medium bomber in the European theater. This is the story of how one unauthorized bolt changed the course of aerial warfare and how the Air Force tried to court-martial him for it. March 1943. RAF Ruham, England. The 322nd Bombardment Group had just arrived, and the mood was somewhere between terrified and mutinous. The B-26 Marauder was supposed to be America's answer to precision medium-altitude bombing. Fast, heavily armed, and built like a flying tank. But it had one problem that nobody could solve. It killed its own crews. The numbers were staggering. In training alone, the accident rate was so high that pilots started calling it the flying prostitute because it had no visible means of support. The wings were too short for the weight. The landing speed was almost 90 miles per hour, twice that of a B-17. If you lost an engine on takeoff, you didn't glide. You dropped like a stone. Matheson had watched 3 crews die in 2 weeks, not in combat, in routine operations. And every time, it was the same thing. Engine failure on the left side during the critical phase of flight, right after wheels up, when you're heavy with fuel and bombs and the runway is already behind you. The Martin engineers said the asymmetric thrust was manageable. They said it was pilot error. They said a lot of things that didn't matter much to the widows back home. The problem was in the propeller feathering mechanism. Matheson knew it the first time he saw it happen. The Curtiss electric props were supposed to feather automatically when an engine quit, turning the blades edge on to reduce drag. But in the real world, with the vibration and the cold and the stress, the system failed. The dead engine's prop would windmill, creating massive drag on one side. The plane would yaw violently, stall, and spin. At 500 feet, you had about 4 seconds to live. The official solution was better pilot training. Matheson thought that was insane. You couldn't train your way out of physics. But he was a staff sergeant. Nobody asked staff sergeants what they thought about aerodynamics, so he stopped asking for permission. On a cold morning in late March, Matheson and 2 other crew chiefs, Eddie Kowalski and Pete Hammond, pulled an all-nighter in the maintenance hangar. They stripped the feathering system from Matheson's assigned aircraft, tail number 131705. Then they did something that would have gotten them thrown in the stockade if anyone had noticed. They hardwired the propeller pitch control. The modification was crude. They bypassed the electric motors entirely and ran a manual cable from the cockpit directly to the pitch actuators. It meant the pilot had to physically crank the props to feather, like adjusting a trim tab. It violated about 15 technical orders. But it worked every single time, no matter how cold it got, no matter how much the plane shook itself apart. Matheson didn't tell anyone, not his commanding officer, not the flight crew. He just signed off the aircraft as mission ready and went to get coffee. The next morning, Lieutenant Frank Morrison and his crew took 131705 on a bombing run to a railroad yard outside Imuiden. 6 planes went out. 4 came back. Morrison's was one of them. And on the return leg 20 miles from the English coast, the port engine took a direct hit from flak. Morrison felt the controls go mushy. The plane started to yaw left. The manual called for an immediate feather, but the electric system was known to be slow. By the time it engaged, you'd already be in a spin. He reached for the feathering toggle, expecting the usual 2-second delay. Instead, he found a hand crank. He didn't know what it was. Nobody had briefed him on it, but he cranked it anyway because the alternative was the North Sea. The propeller blades rotated to feather in less than a second. The drag vanished. The plane stabilized. Morrison brought it home on one engine with 3 wounded men in the back and no idea that he'd just survived because of an illegal modification. When he climbed out and saw Matheson waiting on the hardstand, he asked one question. "What the hell did you do to my plane?" Matheson told him. Morrison stared at him for a long time. Then he walked away without saying another word. Matheson figured he was about to be reported. He wasn't wrong, but Morrison didn't report him to the MPs. He reported him to every other pilot in the squadron. Within a week, every crew chief in the 322nd was making the same modification. Within 2 weeks, the accident rate dropped by 60%. Within a month, the Air Force brass in London started asking questions about why one bomb group suddenly had a survival rate that didn't make sense. That's when things got complicated. The investigator's name was Colonel Raymond Tisdale, and he arrived at Rougham with the kind of fury that only a career officer can muster when enlisted men make him look stupid. He didn't care that the modification worked. He cared that it violated the chain of command, that it contradicted engineering reports from Martin Aircraft, and that it made the Army Air Forces look like they'd been sending men to die in defective planes. Which, of course, they had. Tisdale ordered all modified aircraft grounded immediately. He wanted Matheson arrested. He wanted a full court-martial for sabotage and destruction of government property. And he wanted every crew chief involved to face non-judicial punishment. What he got instead was a mutiny. The pilots refused to fly the unmodified birds. Not quietly, not subtly, they refused in writing. Morrison stood up in the briefing room and told Tisdale to his face that if he grounded the modified planes, he'd lose more crews in a week than the Luftwaffe could kill in a month. 12 other pilots signed a letter backing him up. Tisdale threatened them all with insubordination charges. Morrison told him to go ahead. He'd rather face a court-martial than explain to another man's mother why her son died in a plane that didn't have to crash. The standoff lasted 3 days. Then someone in the 8th Air Force command structure made a phone call to someone at Wright Field in Ohio, and a week later, a team of engineers showed up at Rougham to examine Matheson's modification. They tested it, they measured it, they ran the numbers, and then they did what bureaucracies always do when an outsider solves a problem they couldn't. They took credit for it. The official report, declassified in 1975, describes a field-implemented emergency propeller feathering enhancement developed collaboratively by maintenance personnel and engineering staff. It does not mention Matheson by name. It does not mention the insubordination or the threatened court-martial. It simply notes that the modification was approved for fleet-wide implementation and that the B-26 accident rate declined significantly in the months that followed. Matheson was never charged. He was also never commended. He spent the rest of the war turning wrenches, watching planes come back that wouldn't have made it otherwise, and keeping his mouth shut. But the pilots knew, and they didn't forget. By the summer of 1944, the B-26 Marauder had the lowest loss rate of any American bomber in Europe. It flew more than 110,000 sorties. It dropped more than 150,000 tons of bombs, and it earned a reputation as one of the most reliable planes in the theater. The Widowmaker became the Go Devil. The pilots who once refused to fly it started asking for assignments in Marauder units, and every single one of them flew with a manual propeller feathering crank in the cockpit. The modification became standard on all B-26s by late 1944. Martin Aircraft quietly incorporated it into the production line without ever acknowledging that a 22-year-old sergeant had solved a problem their engineers couldn't. The technical manuals were updated. The training curriculum changed, and thousands of young men came home alive because one mechanic decided that following orders mattered less than doing what was right. Matheson never talked about it much. After the war, he went back to Pennsylvania, opened a garage, and spent 40 years fixing cars. He didn't tell war stories. He didn't go to reunions. When historians tracked him down in the 1980s to ask about the modification, he shrugged and said it wasn't that complicated. You just had to pay attention to what was actually happening instead of what you were told was supposed to happen. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The legacy of Matheson's modification goes deeper than just saving lives. It changed the way the Air Force thought about field innovations. Before the B-26 incident, there was an ironclad rule. Modifications required engineering approval, testing, certification, and formal orders. The process could take months, sometimes years, and in the meantime, men died waiting for bureaucracy to catch up with reality. After Matheson, that started to change. Not officially, not in any regulation you could point to, but on the ground, in the combat units, there was a new understanding. If something didn't work, and you knew how to fix it, you fixed it. You documented it, you reported it, but you fixed it first. This became known as the crew chief's prerogative. It wasn't in any manual, it was just something everyone understood, and it saved lives in ways that never made it into the official histories. The men who flew with Matheson's modification didn't always know his name, but they knew the crank. They knew that when the engine quit and the plane started to slide sideways, they had a tool that worked every single time. No hesitation, no delay, just immediate, reliable response. That kind of confidence changes everything in combat. It's the difference between panic and procedure, between a death spiral and a controlled emergency, between a widow back home and a man who gets to see his kids grow up. Morrison flew 63 missions in the B-26. He brought his crew home every single time. After the war, he became a test pilot, then an airline captain. He flew for 30 years without ever forgetting the sound of that hand crank turning, the feel of the propeller blades biting into feather, the way the plane steadied itself when it should have been falling out of the sky. In 1989, at a reunion he didn't usually attend, Morrison finally met Matheson face-to-face for the first time since the war. They were both old men by then. Morrison walked up to him, didn't say hello, didn't introduce himself. He just stuck out his hand and said, "You gave me 44 years I wasn't supposed to have." Matheson shook his hand and said, "You earned every one of them." That was the only time they spoke about it. The B-26 itself became one of the unsung heroes of the war. Overshadowed by the B-17 and the B-24, it never got the Hollywood treatment. There were no movies about Marauder crews, no famous nose art that everyone recognizes, no memorials dedicated specifically to the men who flew them. But the numbers tell a different story. The B-26 had the lowest loss rate per mission of any American bomber. It was faster than the heavies, more accurate than the light bombers, and tough enough to absorb punishment that would have shredded a medium-altitude aircraft. Once the early problems were solved, once Matheson's modification was in place, it became exactly what it was designed to be. A precision strike weapon that could hit targets the big bombers couldn't reach and survive defenses that would have destroyed lesser planes. The crews who flew it knew what they had. They trusted it, and trust in war is worth more than armor. There's a technical footnote to this story that's worth mentioning. After the war, when aviation engineers analyzed the B-26's design, they found something interesting. The short wings that made it so dangerous during takeoff and landing also made it incredibly stable at cruise speed. The high wing loading meant it could punch through turbulence and flak bursts that would have bounced around a lighter plane. The fast landing speed was terrifying for new pilots, but it also meant the plane spent less time in the vulnerable low and slow regime where fighters and anti-aircraft guns did their best work. In other words, the B-26 wasn't badly designed. It was designed for a very specific mission profile and then deployed before the support systems were ready for it. The propeller feathering problem wasn't a flaw in the concept, it was a failure of execution. Matheson didn't redesign the plane. He just fixed the one system that wasn't living up to the requirements. That's an important distinction, because the lesson isn't that the engineers were incompetent or that the military was negligent. The lesson is that sometimes the difference between disaster and success is one person paying attention to the gap between theory and practice. Matheson saw that gap. He closed it. And because he did, thousands of men came home. There's another piece of this story that often gets overlooked. The modification didn't just save the crews and planes that had engine failures. It changed pilot behavior in ways that made every mission safer. Before the fix, pilots flew the B-26 with a constant low-level dread. They knew that an engine failure at the wrong moment meant death. That knowledge affected their decisions. They flew more conservatively. They avoided situations where losing an engine would be catastrophic. They traded mission effectiveness for survival. After Matheson's modification, that changed. Pilots flew more aggressively because they trusted the plane to bring them home even if something went wrong. They pressed attacks they would have broken off before. They took routes that exposed them to more flak but got them to the target faster. They pushed the performance envelope because they knew the safety net would hold. The result was a dramatic increase in bombing accuracy and mission success rates. The 322nd Bombardment Group, which had been considered a problem unit in early 1943, became one of the most effective medium bomber groups in the European theater. Their target destruction rate went up, their abort rate went down, and their loss rate, which had been catastrophic, became the lowest in their category. None of that shows up in Matheson's service record. He was never promoted past staff sergeant. He never received a medal for what he did. There's no official documentation that connects him to the improvement in the B-26's performance. But the men who flew those planes knew, and in the strange math of war, where one person's decision can ripple out to affect thousands of lives, that knowledge mattered more than any piece of paper. The story of the B-26 and Matheson's modification eventually became a case study at the Air Force's maintenance schools. Not as an example of what to do exactly, but as an example of the kind of thinking that separates adequate mechanics from great ones. The official lesson was about understanding systems well enough to troubleshoot them. The unofficial lesson was about having the courage to act when you know you're right, even if it means going against the book. That's a dangerous lesson to teach in a military context. Discipline and obedience are the foundation of effective armed forces. You can't have every enlisted man making independent decisions about what rules to follow. That way lies chaos. But you also can't have a system so rigid that it kills people to preserve bureaucratic order. There has to be room for judgment, for initiative, for the moment when a staff sergeant looks at a problem and says, "I don't care what the manual says, this is how we fix it." Finding that balance is one of the eternal challenges of military leadership. And the story of Jack Matheson and the B-26 is a perfect example of how hard it is to get right. Because Tisdale wasn't wrong, exactly. Matheson did violate regulations. He did make unauthorized modifications to military aircraft. He did bypass the chain of command and the engineering approval process. In a different context, with a different outcome, those actions could have resulted in disaster if the modification had failed, if a propeller had torn loose in flight, if the manual crank had jammed at a critical moment. Matheson would have been responsible for deaths, not for saving lives. The fact that it worked doesn't automatically mean it was the right decision. It just means it was the right decision that happened to work. That's a subtle but important distinction, and it's one that military institutions struggle with constantly. How do you reward initiative without encouraging recklessness? How do you maintain discipline while allowing for innovation? How do you build a system that's flexible enough to adapt but stable enough to function under stress? There are no easy answers. But the story of the B-26 suggests that maybe the answer isn't about systems at all. Maybe it's about people. About finding individuals like Matheson who have the technical knowledge, the moral courage, and the practical judgment to know when to follow the rules and when to break them. Those people are rare. You can't train for that combination of skills. You can't promote your way into that kind of integrity. You just have to hope that when the moment comes, when the choice is between doing what you're told and doing what's right, there's someone in the room who's willing to take the risk. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. By the end of 1944, more than 5,000 B-26 Marauders were in service with the Army Air Forces. Every single one of them had Matheson's modification installed. The Curtiss electric propeller feathering system was still there, still functional, still the primary method of feathering the props. But now, there was a backup, a manual system that worked when the electric one failed, a last line of defense that gave crews a fighting chance. The modification was so successful that it was retrofitted to other aircraft types. The A-20 Havoc got a similar system. The B-25 Mitchell incorporated a version of it. Even some of the heavy bombers added manual backup controls for critical systems based on the principle Matheson had demonstrated. None of those modifications were credited to him. They were credited to engineering teams at Wright Field and to various technical committees that studied the problem and recommended solutions. The official narrative was that the Army Air Forces had identified a systemic issue and addressed it through proper channels, which was true in a sense. But it was also a lie by omission, because the real story was that a 22-year-old mechanic had solved the problem first, and the institution had spent months trying to catch up. That tension between individual initiative and institutional authority is one of the defining themes of American military history. From Valley Forge to Iwo Jima to Fallujah, the pattern repeats itself. Junior people see problems, they solve them, the system takes credit. Sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes the individual solution is a piece of a larger puzzle, and the real achievement is recognizing the pattern and scaling it up. But sometimes it's just theft. Sometimes it's an institution protecting its reputation at the expense of the people who actually did the work. The Matheson case falls somewhere in between. The Air Force didn't steal his idea. They validated it, tested it, and implemented it across the fleet. They did the work that Matheson couldn't do alone, but they also erased his contribution from the official record, and that erasure matters. It matters because stories like this are how we remember who we were and what we valued. If the only story we tell is that the institution solved the problem, then we're saying that institutions are what matter, that individuals are interchangeable parts in a machine. But if we tell the story of Jack Matheson, we're saying something different. We're saying that sometimes one person acting on their own judgment can change the course of history. That expertise and courage and moral clarity matter more than rank. That the people who actually touch the tools and fly the planes and fight the wars are the ones who know what needs to be done. Both stories are true, but only one of them is complete. Matheson died in 1997. He was 76 years old. His obituary in the local paper mentioned that he was a World War II veteran and that he'd owned a garage for 40 years. It didn't mention the B-26. It didn't mention the modification. It didn't mention that he'd saved thousands of lives. A few months after his death, A group of former Marauder pilots started a fund to commission a memorial. Not a statue, not a plaque, just a simple bench at the Air Force Museum in Dayton with a small brass plate that read, "In memory of the crew chiefs who kept them flying." It's still there. Most people walk past it without noticing. But if you know the story, if you understand what it represents, it's one of the most important monuments in the whole museum. Because it's not about glory. It's not about heroism in the traditional sense. It's about competence, about craftsmanship, about the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping things running when failure means death. That's the real story of the B-26 Marauder. Not the dramatic combat missions or the bombing runs or the victories. The real story is the 22-year-old kid with grease under his fingernails who looked at a problem and said, "I can fix that." And then he did. The technical details of Matheson's modification are still taught in some aviation maintenance courses. Not at the Air Force schools, ironically. They moved on to more modern systems decades ago. But in civilian aviation maintenance programs, where the focus is on practical problem-solving rather than adherence to military procedure, the story of the B-26 propeller system is a classic example of field-expedient engineering. Students learn about the original Curtiss electric system, its failure modes, and the elegance of Matheson's solution. They learn about redundancy and backup systems, and the importance of understanding not just how something is supposed to work, but how it actually works under real-world conditions. Some instructors use it as a case study in risk management. The question they pose is this: if you were Matheson, would you have made the same choice? Knowing that you could be court-martialed, knowing that if the modification failed, you'd be responsible for the deaths, knowing that you were going directly against the people who designed the plane and the officers who commanded the unit, would you do it anyway? There's no right answer. But the discussion that follows is always revealing, because it forces students to think about the ethics of technical work, about the responsibility that comes with expertise, about the moment when you have to decide whether to protect yourself or to do what you believe is right. Most people, in most situations, choose safety. They follow the procedures. They defer to authority. They cover themselves with paperwork and approvals and the institutional armor that says, "I did what I was told." Matheson chose differently. He chose to act. And in making that choice, he accepted the risk that comes with being right in a way that makes other people look wrong. That kind of courage is rare. It's rarer than physical bravery, rarer than the kind of heroism that gets medals. Because it's lonely. Because it's often punished. Because even when you're right, even when you save lives, there's a good chance you'll be remembered as a troublemaker instead of a hero. Matheson was lucky. The modification worked. The pilots backed him up. The threat of court-martial evaporated. But it could have gone differently, and the fact that he acted anyway, knowing the risks, is what makes the story matter. The B-26 itself lived on for a few years after the war. Some were sold to Allied nations. Some were converted to civilian use. Most were scrapped. By 1950, almost all of them were gone. The Air Force had moved on to jets. The era of the medium bomber was over. Today, only a handful of B-26s still exist. There's one at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, one at the Pima Air and Space Museum in Arizona, a few others scattered around the country. They sit in climate-controlled hangars, surrounded by explanatory plaques that talk about their specifications and their combat record and their place in aviation history. None of the plaques mention Jack Matheson. None of them tell the story of the modification that turned the Widowmaker into one of the safest bombers of the war. The official history has been cleaned up, professionalized, institutionalized. The messy reality of how things actually happened has been smoothed away. But the planes themselves remember. If you know where to look, you can still see the evidence. The cable runs for the manual feathering system, the hand crank mounting points, the wear patterns that show where thousands of pilots reached for a control that wasn't in the original design. The metal remembers what the official records have forgotten. That's fitting somehow, because the story of the B-26 was always about the people who worked with their hands, the mechanics, the crew chiefs, the men who understood that machines are only as good as the humans who maintain them, and the judgment of the people who know when the manual is wrong. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. In the decades since the war, there have been countless studies of what made some military units effective and others dysfunctional. The conclusions always come back to the same factors: leadership, training, cohesion, trust. But there's another factor that doesn't show up in the academic literature as much, even though every veteran knows it's real: initiative. the ability and willingness of junior people to solve problems without waiting for permission, to see what needs to be done and do it, to take responsibility for outcomes instead of hiding behind procedure. That quality can't be ordered into existence. You can't write a regulation that says, "Be more like Matheson." Oof. But you can create conditions where that kind of initiative is more likely to flourish, where people feel empowered to act on their expertise, where the default response to a new idea isn't, "Where's the authorization?" but "Does it work?" The units that figured that out were the ones that survived, the ones that got the job done, the ones where morale stayed high even when the mission was hard and the casualties were mounting. The 322nd Bombardment Group was one of those units. Not because of anything special in their training or their equipment, but because when one of their own saw a problem and fixed it, the pilots backed him up instead of turning him in. Because they understood that survival depended on everyone doing their job at the highest level, regardless of what the manual said. That ethos didn't start with Matheson. It was there before him, built into the culture of the unit through dozens of small decisions and examples set by leaders who cared more about results than regulations. But his modification crystallized it. It gave everyone a concrete example of what initiative looked like and what it could achieve. After that, the whole unit changed. Crew chiefs started proposing improvements. Pilots started experimenting with tactics. The rigid boundary between officers and enlisted men, between flight crew and ground crew, became more permeable. People talked to each other, shared ideas, built on each other's insights. That kind of organizational culture is incredibly powerful. It's also incredibly fragile. It takes years to build and can be destroyed in an instant by one bad commander who values obedience over effectiveness. The 382nd was lucky. They had leaders who understood what they had and protected it. But that luck was also earned, because when Tisdale showed up and tried to shut it down, the pilots didn't back down. They stood up for their crew chief. They put their careers on the line for a staff sergeant who'd broken the rules. They demonstrated that the culture of initiative and mutual support was stronger than the fear of punishment. That's leadership. Real leadership. Not the kind that comes from rank or position. The kind that comes from standing up for what's right even when it's hard. Morrison showed that kind of leadership. So did the other pilots who signed that letter. They didn't have to do it. They could have kept their heads down, flown the unmodified planes, accepted the higher risk. Nobody would have blamed them. The system was designed to protect people who followed orders, but they chose differently. They chose to protect the man who'd protected them. And in doing so, they sent a message that echoed through the rest of the war and beyond. The message was simple: we take care of our own. That message is one of the foundational principles of American military culture. It's why the military never leaves people behind. Why units will risk everything to recover the wounded. Why the bond between people who've served together is so strong. It's also why stories like Matheson's matter. Because they're not really about aviation or engineering or World War II. They're about the choice between self-interest and loyalty, between following the safe path and doing what's right, between being part of a system and being part of a brotherhood. Matheson made his choice, Morrison made his. The pilots of the 322nd made theirs. And because they all chose the same way, thousands of people lived who otherwise would have died. That's not a small thing. That's everything. The final chapter of the B-26 story is still being written, not in combat, not in museums, but in the lives of the people who were touched by it, the children of the men who flew them, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren who are alive today because a mechanic made a modification and a pilot defended him. Those ripple effects are impossible to quantify. How do you measure the value of a life that wouldn't have existed if one plane had crashed instead of making it home? How do you calculate the impact of all the things that person did, all the other lives they touched, all the contributions they made to the world? You can't. But you can acknowledge that it matters, that the decisions made by people like Jack Matheson in moments of crisis don't just affect the immediate outcome. They echo forward through generations. There's a woman in Ohio who runs a nonprofit that provides services to homeless veterans. Her grandfather was a B-26 pilot. He came home from the war, started a family, built a business, and raised kids who went on to do meaningful work in the world. One of those kids was her father, and because her grandfather survived, because he flew in a plane that had been modified by a mechanic he never met, she exists. She doesn't know Jack Matheson's name. She's never heard the story of the propeller feathering modification. But her work, helping men and women who served their country, is part of Matheson's legacy whether she knows it or not. That's true of countless people. the teacher whose great-grandfather flew Marauders, the doctor whose grandmother married a B-26 navigator, the engineer whose father wouldn't have been born if a plane had crashed in 1943 instead of making it home. They're all part of the story, all connected to that moment when a young mechanic decided that following orders mattered less than saving lives. And that's the real measure of what Matheson did. Not the technical achievement, not even the lives directly saved, but the vast, unmappable web of consequences that flows from one person acting with courage and skill at the right moment. We'll never know all those consequences, we'll never meet all those people, but they're real. They're living their lives right now, completely unaware that their existence depended on a decision made 80 years ago by a man they've never heard of. That's the power of individual action. That's why these stories matter. Not because they make us feel good, not because they're dramatic or exciting or full of obvious heroism, but because they remind us that what we do matters, that our choices have consequences we can't see. That competence and courage and moral clarity in one moment can ripple out to affect the world in ways we'll never fully understand. Jack Matheson didn't set out to change history. He just wanted to keep his plane from killing people. He saw a problem. He knew how to fix it, and he had the guts to act. That's all it took. One person, one decision, one moment of clarity in the chaos of war, and thousands of lives were saved. And those lives touched other lives, and those lives touched still others. And on in an ever-expanding wave of consequences that we can trace backward to a cold night in March 1943 when a staff sergeant violated regulations and installed a hand crank in a bomber. That's the science of it, the mechanics, the engineering, the practical solution to a technical problem. But it's also the art of it, the human part, the courage and judgment and moral weight of deciding to act when action isn't authorized. Both matter. You can't have one without the other. The best technical solution in the world doesn't mean anything if nobody has the courage to implement it, and all the courage in the world doesn't help if you don't know what you're doing. Matheson had both, technical mastery and moral courage, and because he did, he saved thousands of lives and created a legacy that extends far beyond anything he could have imagined. That's worth remembering, worth honoring, worth passing on to the next generation, because we need more people like Jack Matheson, people who know their craft, who see problems and solve them, who have the courage to act and the humility to let others take credit, who understand that the work is more important than the recognition. Those people are the ones who actually change the world, not the generals, not the politicians, not the people whose names end up in the history books, the crew chiefs, the mechanics, the people with grease under their fingernails and solutions in their heads. They're the ones who keep the planes flying, who bring the crews home, who make the difference between survival and death. They're the ones who matter. And their stories, even when they're forgotten by the official historians, even when they're erased from the records, are the stories worth telling. This is one of those stories. The story of how one mechanic illegally built America's deadliest plane by making it safe enough to live up to its potential. The story of how courage and competence combined to save thousands of lives. The story of how one decision, made in defiance of regulations and common sense and institutional authority, changed the course of a war and echoed forward through generations. It's a story worth remembering, worth sharing, worth ensuring that it's never forgotten. Because Jack Matheson deserves better than an unmarked grave and an obituary that doesn't mention what he did. He deserves to be remembered as what he was, a hero. Not the kind that gets parades or medals or monuments, the kind that makes the hard choice when nobody's watching and lives with the consequences without complaint. That's the best kind of hero, the kind we need most, the kind worth honoring. So here's to Jack Matheson, Staff Sergeant, Mechanic, the man who saved thousands of lives by breaking the rules. May his story never be forgotten. May his example inspire others to act with the same courage and competence. And may we all remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is see what needs to be done and do it, regardless of what the manual says.